Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session called Pandemics, Data, and Family Engagement. My name is Victoria Jones, and I am Director of Data here at NHSA. I am also joined in this presentation by my colleague Bob Manning, who you will get to hear from in a little bit. As the title suggests, we are here today to talk about the pandemic in particular and how the pandemic has impacted family engagement, but also how we can collect data and use data to inform our family engagement efforts, particularly in face of this global pandemic. A lot of the examples and stories and stuff today come from ParentGauge because that is what we have extensive experience with. But whether or not you're a ParentGauge user, you should hopefully be able to benefit from kind of the examples, the stories, the best practices, and the ideas that we're sharing here today. So to get started, I want you guys to reflect back on the beginning of the pandemic. This timing might be a little different for some of you, but writ large, right, we're looking at March, April. Your program might have shut down completely. It might have shut down only for a short period of time. You may have continued serving children and families the whole time. But I want you to reflect back in that initial period of uncertainty, really, whenever that was for your program. And I want you to think, how did you know how families were doing? Especially if your doors closed, you weren't continuing home visits, you weren't running classrooms during the day. How did you actually know how families were doing at that time? I'm going to be quiet for about 5 seconds and let you think. You are also totally welcome to throw your responses in the chat box if you want to hear from each other. And if you need a little guidance, here are some ideas or some ways that you may have collected information. Perhaps you did phone calls with individual families. Perhaps you did a survey of parents and children. Maybe you did video chats, called some families via FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, Zoom, any of those tools. Did you send emails out to everyone hoping to hear back? Were you able to do home visits, even if socially distanced? Did you perhaps drive by people's homes when you couldn't get in touch with them? So just reflect and write down for yourself, either in the chat box or in your notebook, what strategies were you guys using to collect information from families to answer that question of how they were doing and what they needed. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to write notes to yourself or type into the chat box. So the next question to reflect back on is, what did you ask them about? When the pandemic was at its height in your community, whenever that was, what did you actually ask them about? Right? Was it your regular questions? Did you use your strengths and needs assessment? Did you create a new survey? What did you ask about? And some examples of things that you might have asked. Did you ask about employment and whether they had maintained their jobs? Whether they were still working, going into their job, if they were working from home, had their hours increased, decreased? Did you ask them about their health, whether their families were being struck with COVID or facing other health issues? Did you ask them about housing and whether their housing was stable, especially if they lost employment or lost income? And finally, did you ask them about mental health? It was a scary time, and it still is a scary time for a lot of people. There's a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty, and people are facing a lot of things. So did you ask them about mental health, how they were doing? Is there anything in particular that you focused on that you'd be willing to share in the chat box with us? And then finally, how did you track the responses? Was it just in conversations? So your teachers brought back anecdotal evidence to supervisors? If it was a survey, then you were likely collecting that information on paper or online, likely in some form of spreadsheet or report. What were you doing, in any sense of the word, to understand what the needs were and to really review those responses. And so with that, I really just want to get your brain kind of churning back on this stream of questions within the context of the pandemic. What did you need to know? How did you find it out? And how did you actually collect it and learn from it? And that's going to be different across all of your programs, across the country. But we know that a lot of you were doing a lot of different things, whether it was specific kind of data, widget counting, or it was conversations and the interactions that you were having with children and families. So would love to hear you kind of throw in the chat box and share some information about what you were doing if you haven't already. So the agenda then for our conversation today is to cover quality connections, quality data, and that's really getting into the different ways that you communicate with families, how you set up conversations, some best practices in terms of, building connections, making strong relationships, and how you're going to collect data from families. The stronger the connection and relationship you have with families, the more likely you are to be getting quality data. And then secondly, we'll really move into data-informed decision-making. And that's a combination of me showing you some examples and letting you actually think, what can I learn from this? If I was looking at this in my centers, what patterns do I see? What information can I pull from this? What questions do I have? And the hope is that you can then do that back in your centers with whatever data you've been collecting. And so that is our big plan for today. So moving into our first big session on quality connections, quality data. I want you to reflect back. In a normal year, what does your program do to connect with families? We did a little bit of this reflection before, but that was pandemic specific. And so I want you to think back before this all started. What were you doing to connect with families, find out their strengths, find out their needs? Write that down and see if there's any differences between what you were doing before and what you did after. I'm going to wait about 15 seconds, totally quiet, and let you write down notes for yourself or type that into the chat box. All right, so there are a lot of different ways to be connecting with families, whether it's conversations, surveys, activities. Back when we were really able to have group events, you could bring them into your centers. There are a lot of options here, and certainly some of those things have changed. But likely what you found based on the way you connect with families is that the stronger your relationship is with them, that's the stronger that connection between program staff and parents, the better the information you're getting. It takes a lot more time, but you learn so much more. A story that I tell all the time in my data trainings is I push people to think about how to add context to their data. And I'm sure if I said to any group of Head Start staff, at the beginning of the year, if you do your strengths and needs assessment, you are likely to find out a little bit of information, probably some of the lighter touch things like, oh, I just need a little help over here. I want to learn more about child development, and maybe I want help with employment. But then about halfway through the year, or towards the end of the year, if you do the strengths and needs assessment again, suddenly you see that the list of needs has grown. And if you did this without context, all you would see is that statistically speaking, looking at the numbers, the Head Start program has increased the amount of substance abuse, domestic violence, housing instability, and income and food problems. And if I say that to anybody in a Head Start program, they know exactly why that is. It's because at the beginning of the year with new families, they don't know you yet. It's hard to trust somebody with some of those really, really big topics if you're not familiar with them. And so over the course of the year, as you build that relationship, you are more likely to get honest information from families. So when it comes to actually how you connect with families, there's kind of this value trade-off between the time that something takes and the amount of connection that it really brings. And so I've kind of put them on this pyramid just to give you a quick idea of what this looks like. And it's really this triangle, right? So the less time, it takes much less time to conduct a paper survey or a digital survey than it does to have a one-on-one conversation, of course. The personal conversations take way more time, both from the parents and from staff members. So there's that burden on both sides. The paper survey, digital survey is much, much quicker. However, when you think about the connection and the strength of the relationship that builds, the paper survey doesn't really create a relationship of any form, right, between a staff or your program and the family, versus a quality 15 to 20 minute conversation, which you'd get through like the ParentGauge tool or the pandemic survey that we've added. It takes significantly more time, but it also builds a much stronger relationship and builds trust between guardians and program staff. And so there is a trade-off here. And this is not to say that one of these options is better or worse than the other. It's really to push on you guys to think intentionally about which one is right for your program, which one is right for a certain population of families within your program, which one is preferable depending on which piece of information and which time. When things are really crazy and really busy, it might be much better to do something quick and simple and get that immediate information you need. But there, similarly, during a crazy time like a pandemic shutdown, needs can be really different and change really quickly and can be quite difficult. And so perhaps it is worth spending more time on those conversations. There's no right answer to this. I can just encourage you to be intentional about it and understand and, make that decision on purpose instead of out of convenience. So when it comes to conversation tips, we have learned a lot from the, approximately 100,000 interviews that have been done over the last couple years with families using the ParentGauge tool. And so I want to share some of those because whether you're using ParentGauge or you're using some other type of interview conversation tool, or whether you're not really having any structure at all, you're just taking the opportunity to connect with parents. These are some really great tips in terms of really getting the most out of those. So the first is set up comfortable interview spaces. And in particular, consider how you'll do that in a remote environment. Back when we could have parents in our centers, you can think about the level of privacy and comfort that comes from a conversation in the hallway or in a staff room or a family engagement room that has lots of people around, and an interview space that's private, that allows people to speak more openly without others being able to hear. And then also the difference of being in a small isolated room that's very kind of sterile and institutional, and a small private room that's comfortable, has comfortable chairs, has even just soft things like blankets and pillows and art on the walls. All of those things contribute to how comfortable someone is in an environment. Now, when you're doing that in a remote environment, you might be doing this via phone call or video chat, or with a barrier in between you and the family member. And so I think in particular, when you're looking at doing this via phone or being video call, is, encouraging parents to find a space in their home that is quiet and comfortable and private. It's really hard to have a serious conversation when, you've got kids running around and asking you for snacks and to help open things and to come play with you and just wanting your attention. And so even just encouraging a family member, if someone else is there to watch the kids, to be able to go sit in a more quiet room, where they can really kind of focus and have a little time to themselves to reflect. The next really important thing we found is explain what you're hoping to talk about and why. We know specifically with the Parent Gauge tool, when you don't explain what it's for, sometimes parents think that you're just trying to, get a score of, 5 stars out of 5 on, a restaurant type Yelp review. And they don't realize, unless you really explain it and ensure they understand, that you want feedback on how your program is doing at supporting them, at meeting their needs. That this is their chance to provide feedback to you, and that your program will make changes based on that. So if you give them some heads up in advance, explaining what you're hoping to talk about, what you'd like to learn from them, and why it's important, what you'll do with that information, that can be really helpful for framing the conversation and helping the parent get in the right frame of mind and have the right expectations for what's about to happen so that they're not surprised or uncomfortable. And then finally, be open. Set up the screen or other resources that parents can see. I'm sure you've all felt this feeling when you're sitting in a doctor's office and you're giving information about symptoms and they're sitting there very focused on their computer, just like typing things in, not looking at you. You can't see what they're doing. And you don't even totally know, like, are they listening? Are they totally understanding what you're saying? Versus the doctors that are asking follow-up questions, nodding, showing you what they're doing, perhaps just writing a few notes down on the side. One of those situations makes you feel much more comfortable and makes you kind of understand what's happening. And so if you're doing the Parent Gauge conversation, or a survey of any form, if you're doing it in person, showing the piece of paper so that parents can see, angling the screen so that it's open so that they can see responses as you're recording them, it just helps them see what's happening, what's being done with this information, how is it being collected. Now, obviously, if you're doing this over video or you're doing this over the phone, that's going to be much more difficult, but you can still even just share that information with parents. Say, I know we're on video and it might be a little difficult, but I'm actually just, recording some of your answers in the tool that we use so that we can see the aggregate results and know how programs are doing writ large. Or even just hold up a little clipboard with a piece of paper on it, the piece of paper that you're using, and just show them what you're doing so that they kind of understand what's going on. When you feel uncertain or unsafe, you're unlikely to be sharing very intense information. Some other conversation tips for actually during the conversation is be friendly, make eye contact, treat it as a conversation. Even if it's a survey, you don't have to kind of go back and forth, A, B, A, B, A, B. You say something, they answer. You say something, they answer. That again feels very kind of sterile and institutional and not friendly. Even a survey can be used more of as a conversation. It's okay to ask follow-ups, to ask them to expand upon something if you didn't quite understand their answer, or if you can kind of tell that there's a little bit more there that you need to tease out. Especially when you're having conversations or you're doing a survey with an open-ended answer, silence can be your friend. It can be so uncomfortable to sit quietly for a moment if you get nervous talking to people like I do. Sometimes you talk very quickly and you just never stop and you never take a breath between things. But it is important to slow down and give people a chance to think, right? Say you asked an open-ended question where you even just said to a friend, right, as you pick up the phone, how you doing, right? It's a question that we ask all the time at the beginning of a phone call, but often, we just wait for someone to say, yeah, I'm fine, and you? If you actually ask, how's it going, and then pause a little bit, you might first get that like, yeah, I'm doing all right. And then if you just kind of pause and wait, they might really reflect back, right? Or you can say, oh, really? And they might pause a little bit more and say, well, yeah, I've been doing okay overall. Like, for the most part, we're fine. We feel really lucky, right? That my husband and I still have our jobs and we're able to pay rent, put food on the table. Oh, it's been really stressful with this pandemic though. We just emotionally it's each day is a little harder than it used to be. Because you paused and maybe gave that little follow-up of really? You gave that person a little bit of time to really reflect and pull some more information that was important to know. And then, as always, thank parents when you're done. Acknowledge that they took a chunk of time to speak to you, with you kind of leading the conversation for a specific purpose. Then finally, no matter what you're doing, we really recommend leaving some time for yourself for reflection afterwards. So once the conversation is done, sit back with a piece of paper or an email to yourself and ask, what did I learn? What specific actions do I need to take? And who else do I need to connect with? So when you're specifically thinking about family engagement, you want to think like, what did I learn about the family that was extra important or very specific? Or is there just anything I learned kind of about them writ large that will help me understand them better moving forward? Then what specific actions do I need to take? So is it, I promised that I would send them the address of the local food bank, or I promised I would get them set up with access to our online texting system because they haven't gotten those messages. And then do you need to connect with someone else, either to share information, like just mentioning to the classroom teacher, hey, they've been struggling with internet access, so if Johnny over here is missing some of his classes, it might be helpful just to call in afterwards and see if you're able to get in touch with them. Or to connect with your health services department to mention that they've actually really been struggling with getting access to doctors for their kids' asthma because the doctor's offices are all so full and busy right now. Whether it's the pandemic time or it's just a regular kind of Head Start or early Head Start year, you're going to be wanting to think about these things so that you're taking the right steps afterwards. And, take some notes, write down the actual answers to yourself, because we all have the best of intentions that we're going to remember everything that happened. But if you're anything like me, you much more likely get wrapped up in something else afterwards. And then you try to reflect and you're like, oh man, I remember telling myself that I would remember this because it was important. And now I've totally forgotten. So those are just some tips in terms of having strong conversations, whether you're doing it in a guided way, you're using ParentGauge, whether you're using a survey tool of some other form, or whether you're just having an unstructured conversation with parents, some ways to make those conversations stronger, to get quality information and be building more quality connection with families. So then the next stage of this is really data-informed decision making. And to start, what I really want to do is introduce you to some ways of looking at data and kind of walk you through the process of asking questions and interpreting what you see. These examples are obviously just that. They are just examples. They are not examples of real data. But hopefully they'll be mildly familiar or at least applicable to something else that you use, so that when you go back to your programs, you kind of have this familiarity. So to start interpreting data, if you use the ParentGauge pandemic survey, you get this report back from us whenever you ask, and you might look, the top of the page looks something like this. And I'll orient you a little bit so you can see it's a detailed look at ABC Head Start, which is imaginary. That we had 203 responses. You can see that there in parentheses. We've included the report scale so that you can see the answers range from a score of 1 to 5. That gives you a sense of what that average score means. A 4.6 is somewhere between mostly and very much. And then, I've zoomed this in to look at question number 3. So in response to my family has had stable housing, average score of 4.6 between mostly and very much. Out of 203 families, right, that looks pretty good. But it's important also to look more deeply at this. And no matter what system you're using, it's really great to try to break out that data and look at it in subgroups. So you might look in and say, okay, here's the same, my family has had stable housing, and you can see average 4.6 out of 5. But now you can see the exact number of conversations where the parent responded each of those responses, right? So 5 said not at all, 8 said not very much, etc. So I'm going to take about 20 seconds to sit silently and let you review this graph and, ask yourself, what do you see here? Patterns? Are there specific values that stand out to you? Anything that makes you go, huh, or uh-oh? Take 20 seconds. You can write it down for yourself, or you can also type into the chat box and share with each other what you see. All right, so we've got some good notes in here. And yeah, what we're seeing is 156 out of the 203, which we saw on the last slide, said very much. My family has had stable housing. That's great. 2 thumbs up. No problems there. All set. But I, in particular, look down at the not at all and not very much categories to start. So 5 families said not at all, and 8 families said not very much. That's 13 families that have not had stable housing since the start of the pandemic. Even though it's a small percentage and it hasn't dropped the average overall, that's critical information to have. And even when it comes to something like stable housing, I would argue that if someone says somewhat stable housing or mostly stable housing, that's also not great, right? We want people to have firmly stable housing. And we know that when they don't, there can be a lot of uncertainty and a lot of other impacts of that. So what I see here is, not the need to have any drastic change or drastic emphasis on like stable housing for my entire program, but I do see a whole chunk of families that I want to reach out to directly and connect with personally to figure out how we can support them and help them with getting more stable housing. Because especially during a pandemic, that's just a whole additional layer of things to be dealing with. So also when it comes to interpretation, looking at the program overall and thinking about our efforts when it comes to housing, I would ask myself, what do we do under normal circumstances when it comes to housing? I would then compare our results for this question from before the pandemic to now to see, is the need greater or lesser during the pandemic? When it comes to housing, there are actually cities that have stopped all evictions. So there actually might be people who have been able to stay in housing that they would have otherwise been kicked out of because of the pandemic. So the need is going to jump up again quite soon, but you may actually have seen an improvement in a sense in these numbers, or you might have seen that with lots of people losing their jobs or getting their hours knocked down, that the need is significantly greater perhaps than it normally is. And then I would think, what additional efforts might you need to undertake during the pandemic? And this will depend based on what you were doing before and whether the need has or hasn't changed and in what direction. But, think additionally about what else you could do to support a specific population of people that are having housing instability issues that are different now than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And now I'm going to pass it over to Bob so you can hear a different voice for a little while. And he's going to share another story about interpreting data and taking action.
We all know the importance that every child should be read to. Suzanne Prescott of Butler County, Ohio, who was the first one to do 1,000 interviews, discovered in looking at the data that there was a huge correlation between the parents who answered this question, yes, I do set aside time to read with my child, and those who do not. The children being read to simply developed literacy skills much more rapidly. So we developed this slide to show ways that ParentGauge can help you to be sure that every child in your program is being read to. If you look at the left-hand side of the slide, it shows things that you can look at as a whole group. In this particular case, they discovered that the families where English was the native spoken language were reading to the children more frequently than those where Spanish was the native language in the home. And so this is something you can address at a classroom level. Talk to everybody in the class that it's important for every child to be read to. Explain to parents the 30 million word gap that we're familiar with. And so you can help the whole group get an understanding of this. Now on the right-hand side, you can look at what particular families need help. And one thing you may find is that the parents just don't understand how important it is to read to the child. And this is something which can begin with the interviewer, just explaining to the mother how important it is. Most parents want to be good parents, and often that's enough to make a big difference. In some cases, you may find that they don't have books in the native language. We had one instance where a group of families spoke a West African tongue in one particular program. They got them books in their native language, and that made a huge difference for those families. There's another thing that you're probably only going to find out in a conversation. If a mother does not read very well, she may be ashamed to admit that. If you get a sense that that's what's going on, you can simply say, you know, that's not important. It's important that your child hear a lot of words. We've got some great picture books, and you can talk to your child about the pictures. And I've had several programs told me that that was really important to a number of families. So the bottom line on ParentGauge is that it can help every family be sure that every child is being read to, and ones that are already being read to, that they're read to a little bit more. So this is one of the things where ParentGauge can be helpful to everyone.
Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing that. And it actually leads right into what I was going to share next. I also am always one to remind people that open responses are data too. And that's one of the really big values of having a conversation instead of just having people fill out a survey. So looking at this open response, which is just an example, if you saw in response to a question about housing, my husband and I both lost our jobs, so we fell behind on our bills. For a while, our landlord worked with us, but now we have to be out by the end of the month. I'm not sure where we'll go. This person might not have said not at all or not very much when we asked about stable housing, because up until this point, she and her family have been able to stay in their home. However, being kicked out at the end of the month means they need help now. They need support, even if they haven't had a problem before this. An open-ended response like this, you're not going to be able to see when you look at the program averages. But if you did this as a conversation, the person who had that conversation with them should immediately have that as a note to themselves in their post-conversation reflection of they need housing support. We need to figure out either how to help them get caught up with their bills so that they can stay in their apartment, or we need to find them a new place to go. And so it's so critical to be reviewing open-ended responses and looking for certain things like this. You'll see patterns that don't always show up in the kind of concrete numbers. And this person, I'm not sure what they would have responded to when we said, my family has had stable housing. They might have said somewhat or mostly, because they haven't had a problem yet, but they're about to. And so you don't want to overlook this family and their needs. Just because they didn't show up in the data overall, kind of the way that you might pick up on quickly. Another way, no matter what tool you're using, even if you're just using a kind of standard survey, is to look at questions that relate to each other. They might come across different, like they might appear in different sections of a survey, or whatever kind of strengths and needs assessment or conversation tool you're doing. But there are going to be questions that relate to each other, and if you look at the questions kind of as a set that way, you might see patterns that are important to pick up on. So I pulled together a list of topics from the Parent Gauge Pandemic Survey, and I want you to take a look at this and see, like, what patterns would you look for here if you were looking at these 5 questions. So a question about feeling connected to other parents or adults, their response to struggling to control their emotions, child maintaining sleep routine, kind of their child's behavior getting worse, and then being able to meet with program staff via video. What pattern would you look for across all of these responses? I'm going to give you 10, 15 seconds to write notes yourself or type in the chat box. All right, yeah. So I have pulled these questions together because I think they would give a really good picture on kind of the emotional safety and stability of the home. Connectedness, emotions, changes in sleep routine or behavior can be signs of stress or other problems going on, even if they're not kind of coming out to the surface. So I would look kind of overall in my program if there's any of these questions with particularly high or low responses, but then even to get a sense from individual conversations. And then the follow-up to that is, if you identify some patterns, you identify some families that aren't really connecting, they're struggling to control emotions, the children's behavior is giving signs that there are issues in the home, what decisions might you make based on that information? I'm going to give you another about 15, 20 seconds to write notes to yourself or type into the chat box. Again, that question is, if you were seeing, a concerning pattern for some families in responses to these questions, what decisions might be impacted by that information? All right, yeah. So there are several decisions you can make. If your program is really only able to do in-person visits with about 10% of your families, you want to target that at the right 10% of families. And so seeing a concerning pattern in these questions might suggest to you that this is a family where you could do a drive-by, maybe, stand in the driveway and wave, talk to them through the door, maybe drop off a little food, some activities. Then again, there's also, if you're trying to do half the kids staying at home, half the kids coming into class regularly, right? If you're doing a hybrid model, you might want to touch base with this family and see if they could really benefit from the child coming into school a few days a week, kind of getting out of the house, reducing some of that stress, and the opportunity to engage with them a little bit more in person during that as well. So I want to give you another example to do yourselves. So here's another few questions, and I want you to think about those same questions. What patterns would you look for here, and what decisions would be impacted by these responses? So yeah, what I'm seeing here is this information is really useful for understanding the extent to which a family would or would not be able to really engage with online learning or kind of a hybrid learning model. So, if you're seeing not having the technology, not having, the internet or data plan, some form of access, And then not having someone who's able to participate in those, if you're seeing low responses, either from your program as a whole or from a specific set of families, then you can use this information to figure out, who do we need to target with additional resources, such as, donated tablets or laptops, mobile hotspots if we're able to get them, or which children are really most likely to need to be in the centers if only some children can be. Another interpreting data component that can be really useful no matter what tool you're using is to see how your program responses are kind of compared to things nationally. There are things in Head Start that we almost all exceed in so stupendously. And then there are certain things that we are all constantly struggling with. I'm sure you know many of these things. I think you're always asking your colleagues about them, right? Does anyone have any ideas for blank? What are you doing about this? And so it can really be helpful when it's available to look at your program average, which ParentGauge does at the end of the year. We give these benchmarks and this snapshot workbook to see, all right, our average on I feel connected to other parents and adults is 3.8. And that probably looks a lot lower than a lot of your other scores, especially if you're comparing it to something like healthcare and dental care, right? Those are things that we work so hard with on families and can have a big impact on. So this 3.8 might look like a low score to you, but at the very least, if you can compare it nationally, you can see, you're right in the middle of that hill there. Percentile is 52%, and that means, my score of 3.8 was better than 52% of programs last year. And so that tells you all right, the 3.8 is right up the middle. This is still something that we definitely want to improve with our families, especially during a pandemic when people are even more isolated this year, and this would be last year's data. But it at least gives you a sense of that, you're kind of right up the middle there, as opposed to being really, really high or really, really low. And that can just provide some additional context. So no matter what tools you're using, if you're able to kind of see those national norms, it can be really helpful for understanding what your data really means. And with that, I know Bob has another really great story to share with us, particularly around connectedness and relationships.
This next slide I have to show an example of something that comes up as a result of conversation that's totally unexpected. I feel connected to other parents and adults. In Bluefields, West Virginia, coal mining town, the interviewers came back and they said, we've got a lot of fathers out there that just don't feel connected to anybody. Other adults, they don't feel connected to the Head Start program. Sometimes they don't even feel connected to their own families. In many cases, they formerly had high-paying jobs in coal mines. High pay, pride, you can support your family. Skilled work, you can take pride in your skills. And that was, for many of these fathers, just gone. Trulla Coppola, who runs that program, got an idea. They have in their town, in Bluefields, West Virginia, a retired U.S. Army non-commissioned officer who spent his military career training special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trulla thought he might be a good mentor for our fathers. 15 years older, macho profession. Let's get them together in a Head Start Center from 7 to 8 one evening and see how it goes. Trulla went by to turn out the lights at 10:30 and nobody had left. She said, "What's going on?" And the fathers said, as one, "Since we lost our jobs, this is the first person in authority who does not look down on us." And so she continued that program, meeting regularly over the next year. It made an enormous amount of difference. And then there was a follow-on. They got money from the state of West Virginia so that one of these formerly despondent fathers could take his wife and 2 kids to the Fatherhood Institute for full-time training. This formerly despondent father is now a mentor to other fathers. Then there was another follow-on I just learned recently, that the non-commissioned officer himself had been suffering from PTSD when he began being a mentor. And it was so severe he could not concentrate on his courses in a community college to develop skills as a technician. Charlotte told me just recently that as a result of his being a mentor, it's helped him enough with his PTSD that he's just completing now a course in which he will have skills as a technician and be able to support himself in a way that he couldn't before. Thanks for listening to that slide.
Thank you to you, Bob. So finally, using data to inform practice. So when it comes to using your data, I kind of want to give this big warning. Just like our children and families, numbers are multifaceted. You can't distill them down to one item with one meaning, one solution. And just like our children and families, you need to look at the whole context to understand the what and the why. The example that I gave early on about it looking like needs grow drastically during the Head Start year as if Head Start is causing them. If you just look at that straight out and say, well, at the beginning of the year, families only had 3 needs, and at the end of the year, they have 7. Head Start is more than doubling the number of needs programs have. That is a very simplistic and completely inaccurate way to look at the data. And so just remember, especially for the things that you're less familiar with those strengths and needs, it might be a little bit more clear to you that, of course, it's because we're learning more and we're connecting more with them and we're building those relationships and trust. Remember that with all your numbers and whatever you're looking at, you need to understand the whole picture. It's not as simple as you want it to be. Always ask yourself why and what's next. Don't just say, my score is 4.6, go me, and kind of turn around and walk out. Ask why. Ask what to do next. And then when you're looking at your data and trying to figure out kind of what it means, there are some questions that can be really helpful. So ask yourself, if you're looking at a report overall, where did you do well? Where did you not do well? And then what scores surprised you, both positively and negatively? As you're looking at these things, so what you did well, not well, and what surprised you, look for kind of patterns amongst those and ask yourself what aspects of your parent, family, and community engagement strategies are associated with the answers above, right? You might find kind of some commonalities between the things that are either positive or negative to really give you a sense of, oh, there's this component that we changed in the last year because we thought it would improve, and it looks like it's actually not having that impact. Or the things that are surprising us because they're good, that's actually associated with our new parenting curriculum. I think that means it's really working. And then finally, what changes might you make and how well will you know if they worked? If you are going to change something, say, we're looking at a connectedness score of 3.8, and we definitely want to improve that. We want our families to feel more connected to other parents and adults. We're going to try blank and then set out something for yourself. We hope that when we do this, survey questionnaire again in 4 months, we hope we've seen that tick up to at least 4. And then you can actually come back. You've kind of laid that out for yourself ahead of time of what you'd like to see and what changes you're expecting to see, so that when you look at the results in a few months, you actually have an idea of whether something changed for the better or not. So that kind of brings us all around to the question section. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you in the past 45 minutes, but we've got about 10 minutes to take some questions. So let's fire those into the chat box.